Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming back after lunch so promptly. So just a reminder, a little bit of housekeeping, that all the talks that you see in both the stages at the conference, both days, are being recorded, and they'll be put online on YouTube after the event's finished. A lot of people have been asking, so just want to make that one clear. This session is about semantics and culture. We're going to try to unpack and explore this kind of messy and murky world where the grinding gears of protocol engineering meet the squishy bags of meat and water that we find ourselves as, right? So communicating is not easy at the best of times. And when we're talking about these complex cryptoeconomic systems, I think it's all the more difficult. So just another point of order, which is that the running order for the session today has changed slightly due to travel calamity. So there's a big storm in the Eastern Atlantic called Lorenzo. And while it might not affect the US or the mainland Europe that much, unfortunately, our first speaker is based at the University of Reykjavik in Iceland, and all of the flights got downed. In Iceland just as she was planning to come over. So we've switched the order so that Jacky Mallett will be speaking first, Angela Walsh will be speaking second, and then I'll speak a little bit, and then we'll have a discussion. So let me just introduce Jacky very briefly. She's an assistant professor at the University of Reykjavik, and she's working with computer science, but also with some interest in economics and finance. She became quite well known in Iceland for quite extensive commentary during the previous financial crisis, which I don't know if she'll elaborate on that, or you can look it up online. And her talk will be called Shibboleths. So without any further ado, please take it away, Jacky. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I'm a mainstream computer scientist who 8 years ago or so got interested in the banking system as it happened. And the only excuse I have for this, it was a really rainy weekend, but I essentially tried to build a simulation of the banking system as it's currently presented in economic textbooks, and found out that it couldn't possibly work that way. And with that discovery, which is not something you necessarily expect to find, I've been sort of poking away, trying to understand, first of all, the banking system, and later on market and other financial systems ever since. And what I'd like to talk about today, in some sense, is both the background to sort of cryptoeconomics and economics, and from a sort of computer science, cryptocurrency, cryptoeconomics perspective, why we have to be very careful about what we believe and what we don't believe in, and how much of that we incorporate in our understanding of the existing and new world. And from the perspective of an economist, why the sort of view of the economy as a large-scale superset of network systems, conceptually very similar to the internet, may be the paradigm shift that economics has been, in some sense, challenging itself to find for 10 or 20 years now, and especially since the large-scale crash in 2008. And this picture is basically showing you how the economy looks if you look at it as a computer scientist with a network programming background. And it's essentially, just like the internet. You've got a low-level transport layer, which is actually the banking system, and it tends to get rather unregarded for this. It's taken for granted that it can just move money around the world without anyone thinking that this might be actually a minor miracle in terms of how it's doing it. On top of that is the larger financial system that we essentially use to control our economy and to allow ourselves as a cooperating, collaborating species to come together in order to do things that are hopefully fairly economically productive. But economics as a subject, it has to be said, has had a lot of people come to it from other fields and say, all you need is behavioral understanding from psychology or some kind of physics intervention, and all your problems will be solved. So I think anybody who comes in without a good understanding of economic theory needs to at least try to justify why their particular view is likely to be useful. And to do that, especially in the context of cryptocurrency, I think it's useful to look at how these kinds of large-scale systems scale. And there's kind of a who knew what when going on in both fields. In some sense, when economics learns that the banking system is happily creating and destroying money all the time, which is surprisingly late. It's not until the 1930s that John Maynard Keynes publishes the falsifiable textbook explanation of how that's at least partially occurring. And for distributed systems, it's not until the early 2000s that we really start to get a handle on how we're trying to scale our large scale systems and what the issues are when we run into them. And essentially, we can break scaling out into a topological problem, especially when what we're talking about is information transfer. And in this sense, it's information in the Shannon sense, where we're talking about the exchange of different messages. Everybody hearing me talking is actually a very low information state because everybody's just hearing the same message. If we broke the room into multiple discrete individual conversations, we'd have a much larger exchange of information, but we wouldn't get any consensus. We need consensus for lots of things. It's known to be, in some sense, a impossible or intractable problem in distributed computing because of the Fisher consensus result. So most interesting distributed systems are sort of trying to strike a balance between the amount of information they can share and meeting consensus on critical points of that information, which for finance is typically the contents of your bank account. So we know now, thanks to some math in 2002, that a partial mesh network scales better than a full mesh network, which scales better than a strictly hierarchical network. And it scales as a function of the loop capacity, so the number of messages you can handle with your fellow nodes, and the square root of the number of nodes in the system. And the problem with that scaling result in the limit is essentially you get to a point where adding new nodes to a large distributed system doesn't it probably takes some information capacity away from the network because every node is basically using other nodes to relay information to it. And so the more nodes you have, the more relays you need. And at some point, your information capacity actually starts going down rather than up as you add new nodes. Now, I will mention in passing the reason why there's such a high failure rate in distributed system projects in general. And it's this problem on the left-hand side called the lab, which is basically that for small demonstration networks, typically, it doesn't matter what topology you have, anything will work because you won't hit the information capacity limit. It's only when you go out into the field that you start adding nodes and then everything starts failing horribly. So you need to know what you're doing with topology when you're designing these systems, and that understanding can help save a lot of time because you can look at any system and go, this has the right topology for this purpose, or it doesn't. Now, there is one topology that can, under design, scale arbitrarily, and that's the group of groups topology, where you essentially arrange for information transfer between nodes to be as local as possible so that you don't need nodes relaying unnecessary traffic. And there are all sorts of variations on this. It's an open research problem how complex you can make this. You can have long range and short range connections to try to optimize traffic around the network. The human brain seems to do that. We know the internet does it. And interestingly, in this context, so does the banking system. So one of the sort of views of the banking system in economics and also outside of it is that, it's a very centralized, very controlled system. The central banks are in control of it, and the banks are basically this sort of monolithic structure. And nothing could be further than the truth. The central banks would probably like to be in control of it, but they're really not. Mostly their job is to clean up the mess after the banking system goes through one of its periodic crashes. The banks themselves are in this interesting sort of peer-to-peer mesh topology with each other. It depends again on the country as to how concentrated that is. But if you're in the US, you've actually got quite a nicely distributed banking system with lots of local banks managing their local money supply fairly well. And you've got correspondent accounts being used for international foreign exchange. So the interesting thing there is there isn't actually really any exchange going on. There's a lot of netting and occasional borrowing when one side or the other runs out of money. So when we look at this, we see actually the kind of topology that we would like to see in order for it to scale. And while there are major issues with it in terms of concentration in some countries, it's not scaling that banking actually gets wrong. It's something, unfortunately, less tractable. Two, arguably three failure modes for bank systems. The known problem is obviously if it goes into a hyperinflationary mode, which Venezuela is currently experiencing, that will destroy your entire economy quite quickly. This is also what Iceland's gone through a couple of times. But that's something we can control, and we know now how to regulate a banking system. If you let that happen to your banking system, people are being careless. What we can't resolve is the fact that it has terrible fault tolerance against loan losses. And this comes directly out of the accounting equations that are embedded in the double entry bookkeeping technology that it uses. And there's really nothing that you can do about it. Banks essentially are sitting there really as routers in the sort of monetary transmission level, and they make the profit that they need to finance all this from the spread between their interest rates on deposits and on loans. And on that, and you can't get any real degree that I think anybody involved with critical systems would be comfortable with in terms of their resilience to loan losses. So what happens basically is, losses build up in the banking system. At some point, it goes over their threshold to absorb it. And either you have to have government intervention or you have a banking system that's not going to be lending at anywhere near capacity for many years, if ever. So that's a pretty serious problem. And what makes it even more serious is you have also this horrible interdependence between money and credit in the banking system, so that not only do you lose part of your credit supply when this happens, but you also lose a significant part of your money supply, which then feeds back into the market system and the market pricing system. Now, one of the other shibboleths that, again, but floats around both economics and cryptoeconomics is this idea that the money supply should be constant. From the banking perspective of we can't absorb losses at any significant rate, the answer is very definitely no. Having a reasonable rate of expansion tends to ease the constraints with which the banking system operates under, but it's also something that seems to ease the constraints which the market pricing system operates under as well. I'd like to be the sort of bearer of good news and say that when we simulate these systems, a constant money supply solves all problems. And I think 8 years ago, that's what I would have predicted. But that's not the case. You can have a constant money supply. And even if you don't have any credit, you still see these problems of concentration of money building up and the system crashing because of that. It's a bit dangerous to talk about a money supply, in fact. It would be much better to talk about a monetary field where you've got different distributions of money across the economy, and it's are trying to both solve that in terms of the local monetary field and also allow it to be evened up at some level. In that process, they seem to be competing with the banking system, creating money at some level. But what's quite clear is that if you're looking at a normal economy, most of its new lending is not coming from repayment of loans, it's coming from the expansion of money by the banking system. So if you stop that process, at the very least, you're going to have to deal with a problem that you either need a substitute for lending or you need some other way of creating more loans to replace it. Because the economy depends a lot on being able to borrow money in order to bring people together, produce new things, and hopefully make money out of it. This, again, is another one of these fundamental processes that we've built civilization onto. Bitcoin, of course, has not, up to this point in time, had a constant money supply. It's actually had a fairly expensive supply. And of course, the other cryptocurrencies have piled on and expanded that even more, and many of them have failed because of that. We don't honestly know how Bitcoin will behave going forward as it does start to plateau off as designed. But I think it's a very open research question as to what exactly will happen with the next halving, and as the total supply of Bitcoin in some sense starts to contract, as also Bitcoin slowly but surely decays, as Bitcoin gets lost in rubbish dumps or other places. So the idea that just have a constant money supply and everything will be solved, I think, is probably not how things are going to work out going forward. But this is, again, a very open research question, and one that we can explore over time. What's really problematic, and why we, besides the need to separate the monetary transfer activity from the banking system, is that we also seem to be running into problems with market systems as well. And I mean, one way to think of all of this is that we've inherited somehow medieval distributed systems that have gotten us to our current state of civilization remarkably well, albeit the banking system tends to crash every 20 years or so, but we've survived that. But there are problems too with market systems, which are by no means as perfect as some economists like to think. And it's worth pointing out to anybody who's looking at economic theory that it's more or less based on an analysis of prices. The actual monetary flows that create these prices through markets and banking tend to have been, I'm afraid I have to say, they're systematically ignored. And there's a number of reasons for this. One is, a lot of people I've seen in crypto economics grab the quantity theory of money as the explanation for the relationship between price and the money supply. And at some level, that formula exhibits everything that is wrong with our current understanding of markets and money, because one issue is that it has one of the most embarrassing cancelling mistakes ever seen. The velocity of circulation of money, which is a real factor in what's going on, because if we exchange the monetary token faster or slower, we can in some sense influence how many of those tokens we need and have an economic effect. But in the equation, it actually cancels with the number of transactions. Quite a few economists have pointed this out over the time. And the issue is, Fisher seems to have been trying to explain monetary expansion, but he was developing his theories back in the 1910s, 1920s, 10 or 20 years before Keynes comes along and says, well, the banking system does expand the money supply, but we believe it's controlled by other factors around banking and banking regulation. So, but a much more severe problem, and this seems to be known again by economics, we've certainly been able to show it very well under simulation, is that when you're looking at markets as what it is, a remarkable wide-scale price setting solution to what is, in computing terms, an NP-complete problem, it can solve 2 out of the 3 cases. Both Walras and Aaron de Brouw, who are authors of general equilibrium theory, restrict very carefully that in order for a thing to have value, it must be in scarce supply. And this is what we see in simulation. Markets can solve the case where supply is less than demand. They can't solve the case where supply is greater than demand. And I think this must always have been a problem. I think it's always been the case that you could have probably a really good harvest. The pricing mechanisms fail. And in this sense, what we're trying to get out of pricing mechanism, we want a certain amount of food produced. We want some people doing that as part of their job. We obviously want that to be hopefully a few more people than are strictly necessary, because we don't want our food supplies to fail. And we want all this done automatically without central planning being involved, because central planning is fundamentally a hierarchical topology, and that cannot scale to give us the kind of information capacity to do these decisions intelligently. So from that perspective, markets are great. They solve this nasty real-time problem fairly well, but they don't do it for the sort of modern era, where increasingly automation and efficiency are creating cases where supply is greater than demand. And I mean, it's fine, you could regulate this. I would be quite happy for governments worldwide to regulate the price of plastic to be as high as they want so that we all start using it as quickly as possible. But that's not, and that does actually tend to be what economics does. When they run into market failure issues, they in order to solve the problem. And copyright is another example of that. But it's not so much fun when what we're doing this with is drugs, which could be supplied very easily and cheaply, like insulin, but can't because we want to reward the companies concerned for producing them. So we seem to be looking at market failure as becoming an increasing issue in our economy. And this, again, is a system that we really don't have a good way to replace. So from the basis of working at these issues for a few years now, the problem and in some sense the opportunity, I think, is far greater than many appreciate. And really, I think it is the grand challenge for both computer science and economics of our time. Call it whatever you want. I mean, call it cryptoeconomics, call it distributed economics, network economics. It really doesn't matter. One thing about the two fields, there hasn't been a whole lot of communication between them. Although computer science could rightfully be accused of causing economics more problems and headaches than anything else has, in terms of bringing in the systems that have destroyed all the comfortable assumptions that our economics is currently based on, there hasn't been a lot of cross-flow between the two disciplines. And I think this urgently needs to happen, and I hope it really can happen as part of cryptoeconomics, because we have now in computer systems the accumulated knowledge of 50 years of building the internet and large-scale distributed systems, that if we bring it across to economics, and we in turn accept the 300 or more years economists have of scratching their heads over the systems, looking at human behavior, looking at humans, and we're very good at this, exploit these systems, a problem that both fields have in common in terms of trying to keep things under control, then I think more of these problems than may be apparent at the moment are actually in fairly short order. But it's going to need a lot of collaboration and a lot of very careful thought indeed, and proper tools in economics, simulation tools that let them do what we take for granted in network systems now, is reproduce the behavior of these systems to understand them fully and to solve the problems that are facing our society.
Hi, Jacky, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Is that the end of your presentation?
Sorry, yes, that is the end of my presentation.
Okay, let's have a round of applause for Jacky. Thank you very much, Jacky. So we've got plenty of time for questions and answers, both after the talks, and also we'll have a discussion with the speakers at the end of the session. So perhaps I can kick off and ask, Jacky, what do you think are the most stubborn of these shibboleths that we're going to find it hard to shake off?
It's a good question. From the perspective of distributed systems, and it's a field that, like cryptocurrencies, has a lot of snake oil salesmen in it, it's the sort of belief that anything can scale. People are in distributed systems always coming along with new ideas for solving the scaling problem, and they usually work in a lab, and they don't work when you try to actually apply them. And we're really bad at this, in some sense, as economic actors as well, partly because economics doesn't necessarily even understand that this is one of the issues. But there's this belief that we can do anything we like in social systems, and we can re-engineer them on the fly, which has been attempted disastrously several times in the 20th century, without thinking that there's a network system underneath this. It's got fairly low capacity for exchanging information. If you start trying to mess with its topology, then you've probably reduced its capacity even further at the time when you actually need more capacity to exchange all the updates. And this is, both sides are guilty of this, and both sides, in some sense, you have this expression, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. We should be very, very careful of disrupting economic systems, and historically, and at the moment, we're not. We happily bring in sort of new forms of money and this has been incredibly socially disruptive down the centuries every time it's been attempted. And the banking system has been very guilty of this on numerous occasions, of essentially crashing whole societies because people didn't regulate it, or because people came in with new ideas how to regulate it, which didn't work. There was a very sort of several economic crises. The Japanese bubble is one of them. The storyline is, economists went over to the States in London, got trained on textbook economics, came back, applied it, and essentially ruined what was a fairly well-run banking system before that by the application of these new ideas.
All right, we can open it up to the floor. So we've got a microphone here. Please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. And Jacky can only hear you if you are speaking into the microphone.
Hey, Jacky, thanks for the great talk. So I'm interested in the point that we don't get useful information about scaling from lab scale, very small experiments, and yet it's also risky to tinker with the very large scale economic systems. So is there a sweet spot for experimentation? Are things like cryptocurrencies, which are somewhat larger than labs, but smaller so far than central bank currencies, like an appropriate level?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm a network engineer, so one of the sort of rules is you're not allowed to operate on the production system. You can't just go and mess with it. So I would prefer that we build simulations of these systems before we try things out on the live system, although I realize that's probably not going to happen because the crypto people are just going to pile in and do whatever they can. And the danger there isn't, I think it took probably about 300 years for double entry bookkeeping to emerge and find the form that created banking. I think the crypto people will much faster be able to find scalable solutions, but the danger is that they'll be rolled out with a much faster latency than the sort of existing systems can deal with. In an ideal world, which we don't live in, you would carefully simulate everything, find out a nice way to the world, and let things gradually take over. And we can build simulations of these systems. I honestly don't know why it hasn't been done yet. I really don't. The only thing I can think of is there just hasn't been the investment in sort of economics to do that. But the big difference, the thing that really made the difference in network stability in the 90s was we started being able to build simulations of network systems on laptop computers and workstations and so on, and we could just build these, play around with them, and then only roll out changes when we were happy that the protocols involved would actually work and scale properly. And I mean, obviously I'm talking about my own work here, so I'm sort of talking my book, but I think this is what we absolutely have to do with economics. We need, to have multiple teams building accurate simulations of these systems, not the models that economists are currently using, because economic models are based on economic formula, and most of by macroeconomics, if you just look at the terms that they use, the variables, you can basically disprove them or say that they're not very useful at a high level, just on that basis. So we need accurate, reproducible simulations based on double entry bookkeeping, looking at how these systems really behave, rolling cryptocurrency into that so that we can basically include that as one of the options. And then I think that would let us also iterate much more quickly in terms of finding solutions that scale for cryptocurrencies as well. I'm sure that the good cryptocurrency teams are already doing this. I mean, I don't see any reason why you wouldn't.
Do we have any more questions for Jacky? Yes, at the back.
Yeah, hey, Jacky, hey, thanks a lot. Great talk. I could not agree more. Just a quick question. Might you know the work of Perry Merling?
Yes, I do, yes.
Yeah, it's very similar, kind of how he traces the history of American banking, kind of shows that it is actually a distributed monetary system already. Yeah. Hey,
yeah,
thanks a lot.
I'm sort of the opinion, after sort of, digging into economics for several years now, that the right answers are there in economics somewhere. The problem is that they've got, a huge number of answers, and the question is finding the ones that are right and also knowing whether it is a right answer or not. That's the other challenge. But there's a lot of this stuff is somewhat understood in economics. It just hasn't been incorporated in a sort of larger, consistent understanding of all the systems involved.
Got one more question over there. And just a quick note as well, in terms of simulation, we have a session on the side stage first thing tomorrow morning, where we have the kind of latest news on ways to simulate these complex networks and systems.
Hi, Jackie. What is your opinion about, it seems to me that we're trying to reverse engineer how this stuff works, because I was around in the early 2000s when everybody said there's no way Bitcoin can work, right? And here we are 10 years later, and now it seems like what we're trying to do is figure out why did this work when every expert, every economist, computer scientist, et cetera, said there was no way this could work.
Well, I don't think everybody said that.
Well, mainstream thought was that, yes.
Go on. Yeah, I mean, and also I wouldn't necessarily, I'm sure I'm probably offending quite a few economists in the audience. I do apologize. I've come to understand just how hard what you've been trying to do is. But that said, economics on monetary systems is not where I would go for expertise, shall we say. There are economists that specialize in banking. They usually know what they're doing, but they're actually fairly rare and usually sort of a sub-area of economics. I don't know also, I mean, again, we're looking at systems that have very long latencies. So they take, the banking system evolves over decades in terms of its behavior, and so does the economy. So it's possibly a little bit earlier to say that Bitcoin is working. It's worked for a short time, but any currency works for a short time. I mean, the experiments with currencies that decayed over time in the 1930s worked, but they were only really tried for a couple of years. If you're talking about building a long-term system for economic stability that can be used for stable economic systems, you need to measure that over decades or even hundreds of years in terms of its capability. As I said, there's reason to believe that Bitcoin per se may not work for that length of time. But that doesn't mean to say that the ideas behind it aren't extremely powerful. And as I said, double entry bookkeeping originates sometime possibly in sort of 10th, 11th century. It doesn't really find the way it's formed that it's used to create the banking system for 300 or 400 years. And there's a lot of sort of emergent steps that it has to take in order for banking and for monetary transmission to emerge in a way that we can use it to create a complex modern society. I think it'll be the same with Bitcoin. There'll be a lot of little steps that get taken to eventually create the cryptocurrency or cryptocurrencies that we transition to for the sort of next evolution of our financial and economic systems. And for all our sakes, those need to be distributed systems. If there's one thing that, please take away from this lecture, centralized hierarchical systems cannot scale. And several countries tried that in the 20th century, failed catastrophically. Russia may never recover from that experiment. And the price paid is the loss of millions of lives. So, if you want to really kill a lot of people, economics is the way to do it. And, we have to be very careful as we mess around with these things and try to find better answers.
Okay, that's great. Let's wrap up. So Jacky will join us for the discussion at the end, but let's thank her for her talk. Thank you.